Welcome to day 2 of factoring. So on day 1, we factored polynomials that all had a common factor. Today, not all of our terms are going to have a common factor. So if you look at our example down here, my coefficients are 4, 8, -5, and -10. So I can divide 4 and 8 by 2. I could divide 10 by 2, but I can't divide -5 by 2, so that's not a common factor. If I look at my variables, I have an n to the third power, an n squared, an n to the first power, but there's no n on 10. So I can't divide an n out of each of these terms. So I need another way to try and factor this, because there's nothing I can factor out of all 4 terms. So what we are going to do, if I look at my first 2 terms, well, I know I can divide both of these by 4. If I look at my second 2 terms, I can divide both of these by 5. So what I'm going to do is factor those 2 groups separately. So our first step, we are going to draw a line in the middle. So I am looking at my first 2 terms together over here and my second 2 terms together over there. Once I've done that, I'm going to factor the GCF, the greatest common factor, from each side. So in my first 2 terms, I have 4n cubed and 8n squared. Well, I can divide both of those by 4, so I know I can factor out a 4. I have an n to the third power and an n squared, so I know I can factor an n squared out of both of those. So I'm dividing both of my terms here by 4n squared. So what I have is, this would be 4 divided by 4 cancels out, n to the third divided by n squared, that would leave me with n. 8n squared divided by 4n squared, 8 divided by 4 is 2, and n squared divided by n squared cancels out. So what I'm left with here is 4n squared times n plus 2. So I factored my first 2 terms. I pulled out their GCF. Now I'm going to look at my next 2 terms. So I'm going to do the same thing. What can I divide from both of these? Well, I can pull out a 5 from both of those. And actually, these are both negative. I could pull out a -5. So if I divide both of these by -5, I will end up with -5 divided by -5 is +1, and I have an n here. -10 divided by -5 is +2. So on this side of my polynomial, I have, well, that's not a plus sign, I have a -5 and 1n plus 2. Well, this is convenient. In here, I have the same factor. Both of my parentheses here match up. Well, that means these 2 terms have a common factor. I can factor a 1n plus 2 out of each of these. So if I pull out a 1n plus 2, or an n plus 2, what I have left in my first term is 4n squared. What I have left in my second term is -5. So now my polynomial has been factored completely. This is all I've got left. These don't have a common factor. These guys don't have a common factor. There's nothing else I can do here. This is my factored form. if I check my answer, when I multiply these two binomials together, I should arrive back at the polynomial I started with. So if I multiply n plus 2 times 4n squared minus 5. So I distribute an n to both terms. So that gives me 4n to the third power minus 5n. If I distribute a 2 to both terms, I end up with an 8n squared and a negative 10. What's up? Oh, it's fine. Mm-hmm.
My math teacher has a class and I was wondering if you know anything about this. It's okay if you don't.
I would have to Google it.
It's okay.
But I don't know how helpful
It's
it
alright.
would be.
Just wondering.
Sorry, Julianne.
It's alright. You know.
Sorry, guys. So I distributed 2 to 4n squared, and I got 8n squared. I distribute 2 to negative 5, and I get negative 10. Okay, so I finished distributing. I don't have any like terms, so if I put my answer in standard form, yeah, this totally checks out. This is the polynomial I started with. So check, my answer's right. So after you factor the GCF from each side, if you've done everything correctly, you should end up with your factor in parentheses being the same. If that factor in parentheses is not the same, it means you either didn't pull out the greatest common factor, or maybe this polynomial just doesn't factor the way you wanted it to. So once your parentheses are the same, we wrote our answer as the thing they had in common, the n plus 2, times the thing that were left over, the 4n squared and the minus 5. Once I have my answer, I check by multiplying to make sure that my answer is correct. We're going to do one more on the inside, and then you will have the rest of these to practice on your own. So let's go straight for let's do bottom middle. If I look at this problem, I have 9c cubed minus 12c squared plus 18c minus 24. Well, the first thing I'm going to say to myself is that all of these terms are divisible by 3. So the very first thing I'm going to do is factor out a 3 from all of those terms. So that leaves me with 9 divided by 3 would be 3c cubed. Negative 12c squared divided by 3 would be negative 4c squared. 18c divided by 3 would be 6c. And negative 24 divided by 3 is negative 8. So I pulled out my GCF first. Always look to see if you have a greatest common factor first. Now in my polynomial, my 4-term polynomial here, I don't have any common factors left. Between 3, 4, 6, and 8, well, 4, 6, and 8 could be divided by 2, but I can't divide 3 by 2. I have a c cubed, a c squared, a c, but this term doesn't have a c, so I can't pull out a c. So I know I have all of my common factors. So now I have to factor by grouping. So I'm going to look at my 2 terms separately, or sorry, my 2 halves of the problem separately. So I draw my line down the middle. On the left side, I have 3c to the third power minus 4c squared. from those two terms, I can't factor out any numbers because 3 and 4 don't share any common factors, but I can factor out c squared. So from these two terms, if I factor out a c squared, I'm left with 3c to the third power divided by c squared would give me, well, 3. C to the third power divided by c squared is c. When I divide my second term by c squared, negative 4c squared divided by c squared, I'll have negative 4. Then c squared divided by c squared cancels out. If I look at my second two terms, 6c and negative 8, the only thing I can divide both of these by is a 2. So if I divide or factor out a positive 2, 6c divided by 2 is 3c. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. So I know I've done something right. My two factors in parentheses are the same. So when I write my final answer, I can pull out my the factor that they have in common, 3c minus 4. And what I'm left with is c squared plus 2. But I also have this 3 that I factored out at the very beginning. That was my GCF. So this is also a factor of my polynomial. So that I would just drop right down in front. So make sure you check for a GCF first before you factor by grouping. And don't forget, if you don't end up with the same thing in parentheses, you either didn't pull out your GCF or you didn't pull out the greatest common factor of your terms. So you have 8 more problems left on here, and then an IXL for this practice too.